Mr. Holzer will be in conversation with David O. Stewart. David is a recovering trial and appellate attorney and a best-selling author of 5 history books and 5 historical novels. His most recent nonfiction work is George Washington, The Political Rise of America's Founding Father, which was called an outstanding biography by the Wall Street Journal and won several awards for best work of history. In 2023, David received the Lifetime Achievement Award of the Washington Independent Review of Books. Critics have called him an acknowledged master of narrative history and one of our best new writers of historical mysteries. David is an excellent choice to introduce a Lincoln historian, since his first novel was The Lincoln Deception, which explored the secrets behind the Booth conspiracy. Our noted author is Harold Holzer, a distinguished scholar, and our most prolific chronicler of the life of Abraham Lincoln, as well as the political culture of the American Civil War era. In fact, Harold's website lists him as Lincoln Scholar, a title he richly deserves. Harold has authored and co-authored 55 books, including at least 38 separate works about our 16th president, as well as numerous other works about the Civil War era. He served for 6 years as chairman of the Lincoln Bicentennial Foundation, and for the previous 10 years co-chaired the U.S. Abraham Lincoln Bicentennial Commission appointed by President Bill Clinton. He will be sharing with us today his book, Brought Forth on This Continent, Abraham Lincoln and American Immigration. An editorial review of the book states, as a brilliant historian with a keen sense of the passions and problems of our own time, Harold Holzer has given us a powerful and illuminating study of Abraham Lincoln and immigration. It was a treat for me to read this book. I have read extensively about Lincoln, who is my favorite president. I also took a college course on Honest Abe and directed a play about him. I found this to certainly be a timely book, considering how immigration has become such an important issue in our nation today. In reading his book, it was fascinating to learn that immigration was such an important issue during Lincoln's time. In addition, it was illuminating to read about Abe's path to becoming president and how immigration played a role in his being elected and in the Civil War itself. I now turn the program over to David O. Stewart.
Thank you very much, Leonard. And Harold, this is on, right? There we go. It's great to be with you.
Good to see you and to be with you.
I had fulsome praise that I was about to launch into, but it was just done. So,
I mean, feel free, but it's okay.
I know. I hate to see that cut short, but I don't think it was. This is an interesting topic, and it's not easy to find a topic that hasn't been much explored in the Lincoln literature. You would certainly know as a true expert on the subject. And you've illuminated neglected corners of Lincoln's life in other books. What drew you to this?
Well, I'm the grandson of immigrants, so that's the foundational inspiration. My grandparents came here from Europe in the 1890s, and I knew one grandmother of the 4, and was always fascinated about her clinging to certain aspects of her European ancestry, religious culture and such, and yet her eagerness to be as American as she could. She loved the Roosevelts. She followed, she watched the Ed Sullivan Show. These were Americanizing instincts. And she never learned to read or write, but she felt herself to be fully assimilated. And so that's the foundational inspiration. Back in 2016, when 2015, when the Hillary Clinton was running against Donald Trump, 2 issues struck me as rising to the surface and worth looking back at. One was the relationship with presidents and the press, the so-called fake news phenomenon, and the other was immigration as a major issue, looking at it through the lens that I always look at things through, and that's the Lincoln lens. I ended up doing the press book first. So this was, I mean, that's why I did the immigration book. It's kind of the back end of a 2-book deal, but I've been wanting to do it for almost a decade.
And the press book is great if you haven't read it. So, one of the things, the first question that popped up in my mind as I started reading it was, I've read some Lincoln stuff, not just yours, and I had no sense of where his people came from and when they came. That the Lincoln origin story in this country doesn't seem to be very important to people, and it wasn't clear to me that it was important to him.
In fact, it was unimportant to him. He said things like, I don't care where my grandfather came from, I only care where his grandson is going. He was an immediatist when it came to that, and I think he also, because the story of his mother's side of the family is so not understood. I mean, it's unresearchable. It's buried deep in the past, stories of illegitimacy and other things. And we'll never know about his mother's side. But his father's side actually can be traced, and it traced for around 1620-something, when his 7 times great-grandfather came from Hingham, England, as an apprentice weaver, and settled in a town in Massachusetts that they named for their English ancestral home, Hingham, Massachusetts. The trail runs hot and cold after that, but they eventually made their way, the Lincoln descendants, to Virginia and then to Kentucky. And again, Lincoln at one point says, I think some of my descendants, some of my ancestors were Quakers, but I'm not sure. And again, not terribly interested in the past.
Yeah, and we think of him as born in the forest and, in want. So, I mean, for something like 9 generations here, they hadn't blazed a big path.
They had not. And by the way, the path was almost interrupted violently and permanently when his grandfather, whose name was Abraham Lincoln, was attacked by Native Americans and killed. The little boy with him was Lincoln's father. And the older son shot the Native American attacker just before the attacker turned to little Thomas Lincoln, who went on to become Lincoln's father. And, in my book about immigration, I raise the thread every once in a while because I don't think it should be ignored, that there are some anomalies that have to be addressed. And one of them is Lincoln's indifference toward the rights of indigenous people.
Yeah.
I mean, Lincoln was willing at one point during the Civil War to make homestead land in the West available to non-citizen European immigrants. But it never occurred to him that there were other people who had previous claims to the land. And I think some of it was the family story, which he did know about his grandfather being killed by Indians, as he put it.
Yeah, that might color your perspective. The story in this book really starts in the 1850s, and you portray a very complex nation, both sort of ethnically and politically at that time. And it's not just the pro-slave North against pro-slave South against the anti-slave North. There are many other currents that you have to navigate, and Lincoln had to navigate. Can you sort of set that stage a little?
Sure. Could I back up a little bit to the 1840s to set the
right.
stage? So, immigrants have been coming into the United States really from the beginning of the establishment of the country, with no rules, really. The Constitution gives the federal government no authority over immigration. In case anyone was wondering where all this authority comes from, it comes from court decisions and later legislation. Originally, the federal government had power over naturalization, with the individual states having the power of policing new arrivals. And so they came. Within 5 years, an arrival could become a citizen. Not people of color, but Europeans could become citizens. Only during the period of the Alien and Sedition Act was that threshold raised to 14 years. Then it fell back when Jefferson became president to 5. And that's where it was in the 1840s when waves of Catholic immigrants began arriving in the United States. So I point to Lincoln's first statement on immigration, which came following a riot in Philadelphia, 1844, a riot that cost several churches, which were destroyed, libraries of Catholic literature, which were burned, people were killed in the streets, and a lot of the blame went to the Whig Party, Lincoln's party, because of its hostility toward Irish Catholic immigrants. Why were they hostile? Because, for one thing, Irish Catholics were predominantly joining the Democratic Party in opposition to the Whigs, because the Democrats were smart enough to recruit them aggressively. So Whigs around the country are compelled to denounce the riots, or at least absolve themselves of responsibility. And in Springfield, Illinois, a Whig meeting takes place. Abraham Lincoln writes his first statement for this little meeting, and it says that no obstructions should be placed in the path of new arrivals as long as they learn about our country. Then the Irish potato famine strikes, and immigration from Ireland explodes exponentially. And resistance increases, and anti-Catholicism spikes. This will be augmented in 1848 by the failure of democratic revolutions on the continent, producing a wave of German Protestant immigrants who were more anti-slavery, more inclined to join the Whigs, and later the Republican Party. So I know that all sounds very complex, but now we get to the 1850s, and there is an organized movement to expel or deny rights to Catholics. It's not unlike some of the messaging we see today. They're poisoning our culture. They're not. They don't want to join us. They want to be different. Their allegiance is to the Pope, not the president. Their allegiance is to the local priest, not the mayor or the alderman. They're dangerous. They're taking work away from you. That's been the argument for 2 centuries. They're taking work away from you, even though the people who have been here and stepped up one notch on the ladder have no intention of doing that work anymore. They need someone else to do the work. Anyway, it gets ugly to the point of the organization of a third party, a third political party, calling itself the Know Nothing Party or the American Party, which wants to reinstitute a 14 or even a 21-year waiting period for citizenship. Interestingly, if we had a 14 or 21 year now, we could settle the issue.
I have always admired the Know Nothing Party for truth in advertising. But
you know how the name was created?
I was going to ask you to explain that, because it is odd.
I mean, Horace Greeley took credit for it, as he took credit for many things in the 19th century, the editor of the New York Tribune. Supposedly, the early meetings of the nativists were secret, top secret, because they knew they were a little bit sketchy, right? So if someone walked by and heard, a great party going on, they wanted to join, they would knock on the door and say, "What's happening inside?" And allegedly the person answering the door was instructed to say, "I know nothing. You're not welcome." So that's how allegedly the name was created. But they like to call themselves the American Party. And in 1856, they ran former President Millard Fillmore as a presidential candidate, and the Know Nothings got 22% of the popular vote. One of the most successful third-party candidacies ever.
And that is the only time Millard Fillmore actually ran for president.
Yes, because the other time he didn't have to.
Yeah.
Yeah. This was a real brainworm of a third-party candidate, right? To be infected with the nativist impulses strong enough to move you outside of the mainstream of politics, either the Republicans at that point or the Democrats.
So can you hook this up now we've got the know-nothings, and we've got the slavery issue, which is breaking up both parties. And so we need a reorganization. So what happens, and where is Lincoln in that?
You know, I use Lincoln's most famous statement on nativism in the book, but I try to reinterpret it. In 1855, before the Republican Party really takes off as an independent national party, its beginning, Lincoln tells his best friend, "I am not a know-nothing. How could I be? How could anyone who is opposed to mistreatment of people of color be opposed to mistreatment of any class of white people?" It's a very famous letter. Every biographer of Lincoln uses it to show how opposed he was to nativism. But it's a letter he wrote to his friend, and it wasn't made public until the year after he died, 1866. Lincoln was very quiet about the rise of the Know-Nothing movement because the Republicans needed a big tent like this to form itself and be successful. It needed former Democrats who were opposed to slavery. It needed Whigs who had nowhere to go when the Whig Party began crumbling in the 1850s. It needed elements of the nativists who were anti-slavery. And Lincoln was very careful not to offend the nativists in the period between 1856 and his election to president in 1860. As a result of which, he was accused of being a know-nothing, particularly in the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And it got very ugly because Douglas's supporters said, this guy secretly wants blacks to vote and the Irish not to vote. And in the midst of his freedom advocacy, Lincoln actually did believe, almost paranoidally, that Irish workers were being smuggled into Illinois to vote illegally against him. He said at one point, right before the senatorial election, that he saw 3 Irishmen carrying carpet bags. This is before carpetbaggers were a thing, but that's a travel satchel. And they're clearly here to vote me down. Couldn't we hire detectives to follow them around? I know. The irony here is that Lincoln had been a great supporter of what was called internal improvements. We know it as infrastructure. Illinois had gone bankrupt supporting infrastructure. Infrastructure has to be built, canals and railroad lines. Who does the laying of track in the East? In the West, it's Asians. In the East, it's the Irish who are coming in needing work. So the irony is that the influx of future voters and perfectly legal voters is coming as a result of Lincoln's party, which is indifferent at best to immigration, luring them in with infrastructure projects.
One of the features of the book that came through strongly to me was how cautious Lincoln was. And he's attempting this intellectual straddle, which from the 21st century looks very difficult to do, of not ticking off the know-nothings while being the anti-slavery candidate.
Yeah, it's very tricky.
The know-nothings are bigots by most standards.
Yeah, and so are many Democrats and many Republicans,
Right.
at least by our standards.
Yeah.
Surely. Yeah, he was playing a dangerous game, and he was outed for it from time to time. And yet, he did say at one point during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, let me set this up. It's a good story, I promise. He's invited to a German picnic in 1858, a July 4th picnic. Why he didn't go, I could not find. But it's such a great opportunity. Maybe he just had to be downstate. Because the Chicago Tribune reported that every politician in the region was there shaking hands. It was a very useful event. 7 days later, Lincoln is scheduled to speak in Chicago in response to Stephen Douglas, who's the senator and who's running for re-election. Lincoln is opposing him. It's not a real Lincoln-Douglas debate, but it's enough of one so that when they schedule the debates, Douglas says, we've already done Cook County. We're not going back to Cook County. So Lincoln gets up, looks at an audience like this, and in the front row is a big German guy named Anton Hessing. He's the leader of the Germans in Chicago. So Lincoln realizes he's going to have to say something to the Germans because he's dissed them the week before. And he says, this is, I'm paraphrasing heavily, this is Independence Day. This is when we celebrate the founders. And some of their descendants are here today. All honor to them. They founded this country. But I see in this audience as well people who are not related by blood to the founding generation, who have come here more recently. But they are entitled to all the rights as the founding generation because that's what the Declaration said. Today and all days, they are the blood of the founding generation. He didn't say they were poisoning the blood of the founding generation. He said they were the blood of the founding generation. I don't think that helped him among the know-nothings, but he said it. And then later in the debates, he said, I want a free West where every Hans and Baptiste and Patrick, that was a stretch for Lincoln, and Patrick, the Irish, can have access to free land in the West. So the evolution is taking place subtly, but he never denounces the know-nothing party, the American party, or the movement directly.
Well, since you brought it up, let's talk about Hans for a minute.
Okay.
Because the significance of the German vote was pretty large. I hadn't appreciated in Illinois that it was, but also in other communities.
Yeah. Wisconsin, Ohio, Missouri, although it never helped him in the presidency. And the Germans who come here are these, progressives who have been anti-dictatorship, anti-monarchy on the continent, and they arrived here and remained anti-slavery. They joined the Republicans. They became increasingly influential. They were largely Protestant, and although there was resistance and attacks, they formed their own clubs, their own gymnasiums. They still escaped most of the backlash that the Irish had been subject to, and they became an integral part of the Republican Party movement and the anti-slavery movement, and a huge part of the 1860 political campaign when Lincoln got the nomination in Chicago, with some German support, although the most famous German in America, Carl Schurz, stayed very loyal to the favorite, William Seward. But then he met Lincoln. He had met Lincoln during the debates, went to Lincoln's home as part of the official delegation, notifying him. In those days, you had to tell the person that he'd been nominated, even though there was a telegraph. Lincoln had found out, the day before that he had won the nomination. And Schurz was very proud that he had said to Lincoln, I hope you have no resentment to me. Lincoln said, no, you're a hero to the Germans. And Schurz pledges his loyalty, shakes Lincoln's hand. He writes a one-word description of that moment to his wife. He said, he took my hand in his. Ouch. And then he campaigns relentlessly all over the West, what we call the Midwest. He speaks at Cooper Union for Lincoln, where Lincoln had spoken. And he really rallies the German vote. Now, we can't, it's hard to do an election district by election district analysis. But if the German vote wasn't dispositive, it was very important. And the Republicans had not won Illinois in 1856. They won in 1860.
Let's sort of speed up a little bit here. We're in the Civil War, and Lincoln is running for re-election, and this leg to his campaign, the German American people, has been blowing hot and cold. Can you talk a little about how he had to scamper back with them?
Well, it blew hot in 1861 after the attack on Fort Sumter. There's a huge rally in New York City at Union Square. The flag of Fort Sumter is brought to New York and is hoisted next to the big equestrian statue of George Washington that still stands there. As you may know, it may not stand there forever, but it stands there. It's been there since 1854, I think. 100,000 people come to these rallies to recruit. There's a separate rally for Germans and Irish. Lincoln realizes we're on to something, and he works with the Archbishop of New York to develop a list of Irish leaders he wants to organize regiments. Fenian Brotherhood leaders like Michael Corcoran and Thomas Francis Moore. James Shields, with whom he had once nearly fought a duel in Illinois, is recruited. And on the German side, Franz Sigel in Missouri is recruited. None of these generals did particularly well on the field, but they were recruiting magnets for their respective ethnic groups. And by the end of the war, 500,000 foreign-born soldiers have fought in the Union ranks. 23% of the Union Army speaks with an accent or brogue. It's something that's not generally understood. But when these generals started to fail, men like Sigel, who Lincoln transfers to the east and then Grant essentially dumps, saying he'll never do anything but retreat. Actually, he retreated so much that he became known as the Flying Dutchman, which is one of the best nicknames, Dutch being the Americanization of the word Deutsch. You became Dutch. That the Germans were getting a little resentful. And also they were pure in their anti-slavery ethos. And in Missouri, emancipation, which had been declared in 1863, did not apply. It was a slaveholding state, but it was not in rebellion. It was not part of the Confederacy. And the Germans in Missouri said, we've been fighting for 3 years. We want you to extend the reach of the emancipation to our state. And Lincoln said, I have no constitutional authority because you're not in rebellion. Did this as a commander-in-chief. It went back and forth. And the Germans actually, and some people say this was exclusively an anti-slavery movement. In fact, it was a German movement. A separate convention is held a week before the Republican convention, 70% of whose delegates are Germans, and they nominate the man who had run and lost for the Republicans 4 years earlier, John C. Fremont, as a third-party candidate. So suddenly Lincoln's reputation among German voters has plummeted, and he is on very dangerous political ground. Carl Schurz goes AWOL practically from his unit. He's now fighting. He had been ambassador to Spain and came back to raise a regiment. And Schurz came back, and Lincoln vented, and how could these people do this to me? And ultimately, Lincoln made some changes in his cabinet as a concession to progressives. The Fremont candidacy evaporated, and Lincoln won re-election. Again, because of German support, because they abandoned their effort to topple him.
There's another highly charged, ethnically charged moment right a year before that election with the New York City draft riots. And your description of it is terrific. It's powerful. It's the best I've read. But it was striking to me that Lincoln is quite aloof from that. I mean, today we would expect a president to address or at least comment on something that killed lots of people and almost burned up the city.
Yeah. I've never really figured out what the early indifference was. I have some ideas. One reason is that his son, who was coming home from Harvard to take care of Mary Lincoln, who had been injured in a carriage accident that some people believe was an assassination attempt directed at Lincoln. A wheel of a carriage was loosened. Mary, of course, who had bad luck throughout her life, fell from the carriage. More bad luck, she hit her head on a rock. More bad luck, it got infected. Lincoln says to Robert, come. Well, Robert's in New York. He came through New York and he saw there was a riot going on and he thought it would be fun to watch for a while. So he delayed by a full day. So maybe Lincoln didn't take it as seriously as he should for that reason. Also, the governor of New York thought he had quieted the crowd at one point. race riots were not that unusual, tragically. And this basically turned into a race riot pretty early, with black people being driven off wharves and into the Hudson River, an orphan asylum on 43rd Street and what is now 43rd and 5th burned, with more than 200 black children inside, but the children escaped and were saved by an Irish kid who directed them to a police station. But it was largely an Irish riot. But Irishmen were also attacked, those who supported the Union and supported emancipation. Lincoln, when he learned that there were troops at Gettysburg who had not been sent into the fray, which of course infuriated him because he thought that General Lee should have been pursued to Virginia and destroyed, he had them sent up to New York to quell the riot. But it was 3 days of mayhem. Again, it's a very big city, and the mayhem was sort of from 3rd Avenue and 40th Street to 59th Street, across 59th Street and down the west side, with a little bit of involvement in around Gramercy Park. There were some parts of the city that saw no involvement. Newspaper Row did. The New York Times was attacked. The editor, along with one of his investors, Leonard Jerome, positioned themselves on the roof with a Gatling gun. And I used to say if the Times had been attacked, then the Nazis would have won World War II, because Leonard Jerome was the grandfather of Winston Churchill.
Oh.
But I later found out that his daughter was already born at the time, so I can't say that. But I can say that I used to say it. Jenny Jerome was already born, so yeah. But he was up there.
Well, I wasn't ready for that part of the story. Let's start to tie it up a little bit, because you do poke into a corner I was unaware of, which is legislation, which late in his presidency, Lincoln begins to recommend to address immigration, which has not been the subject of much legislation.
So I'll do this very quickly because I know we're almost out of time. But 2 weeks after Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, from his sick bed, he has smallpox, a more serious case, I think, than people have acknowledged or that historians have discerned. He writes his annual message, the equivalent of today's State of the Union message, and calls for immigration reform, which includes the first Federal Bureau of Immigration, expanding landing stations like Castle Garden in New York City, which is absorbing 70% of new arrivals from Europe at that point. And most remarkably of all, saying that the Army needs men, the mines need people, farms and factories need workers. There's been decimation of the male population in the North. He proposed that the federal government pay for the transatlantic passage of potential immigrants who still have no walls, no razor wire. They can just come in, register, and within 5 years become citizens. That proves to be a bridge too far. Congress doesn't do that, but they do a compromise bill. They encourage private industry to lend money to potential immigrants, create a system for repaying. Some people say it's like indenture, others say it's a brilliant idea. And immigration picks up again. It had declined during the Civil War, and it picks up again and provides either huge enrichment of the armed forces or the cliche, as in Gangs of New York, the movie, that people are hustled off the boat and dragooned into the army, which is it's an exaggeration. But a $300 bounty means a lot to a new arrival. And then he sort of cleaned up the bill the next year to make it even more effective. And that was, as Robert Caro has observed, not yet in his book, but privately, the last positive immigration bill in the United States for exactly 100 years. It was signed in 1865. Lyndon Johnson's bill expanding immigration to Southeast Asians displaced by the war there was 1965. So it was a milestone. And the other difference is members of the House write a bill, Senate writes its own version of the bill, then they reconcile it into one bill, and all of the congressmen who had written the bill voted for it. That's not the case today, right? We had an immigration reform. Members of the Senate wrote a bill, and then they said, we don't know what this bill is. We're not voting for it. The difference is that the legislation went through.
Well, since you've mentioned today, just give you one last shot before people ask their questions. We always look to Lincoln for wisdom. And he was navigating a pretty treacherous minefield politically. Is there something we learned from his tap dance through that minefield that we should pay attention to?
Lincoln reiterated in any kind of crisis that this was a country not founded by blood or by nationality, but by an idea. The idea that all men are created equal, and the idea that this country was a refuge for people and a place of opportunity. He never lost that basic belief. I think some of us have lost it in the last half century. But there is no American race. We are supposed to be a country of open doors, and I think Lincoln would have liked that we're supposedly a land with a torch that lights the way to an America that a diverse population can embrace. That's the wisdom that's still out there, I think.
Do we have questions? Please.
First one is always the hardest one. There we go.
Yeah. Thanks very much, Harold. Wonderful talk, and David. Did immigrants play any role in the economic reconstruction of the South after the Civil War, given the economic devastation in the South, the fact that enslaved blacks were now free, and some of them were moving around, and obviously those looking to rehabilitate the Southern economy needed labor, and probably in some cases would have preferred white labor as opposed to free black labor. Was there any role of the immigrants in that?
To the extent that people had mobility, there was a development of interest in settling there. But it was also considered an area of devastation at this point. What I find interesting is that, most early immigrants were following family members to this country. We disparage that in some cases now as chain migration. But in fact, it was a useful thing because people had somewhere to go and somewhere to stay when they arrived instead of migrating to shelters in unknown territory. The vast majority of immigrants instinctively knew from their family members that the North was a place of opportunity where you could start at the bottom and potentially, if you worked hard enough, rise. They knew that in the South, the first rung of labor was performed by enslaved people, and there was no easy step toward opportunity and toward the American dream. That's why the Civil War found the country so overpopulated in the North. Only 250,000 Germans served in the Union Army, 180,000 Irish, 15,000 Irish served in the Confederate Army because there were none. And that same number fled the South for the North during the war, 15,000. So the answer is the South was considered by many immigrants as impenetrable aristocracy. And it didn't change much, but, some novelists, not that I'm disparaging novelists, did paint the portraits of Irish carpetbaggers and German carpetbaggers. They were easy to sneer at, I guess.
Many people consider Lincoln our greatest president. What role did the Civil War have to do with him being designated that way?
Well, I mean, the front line about Lincoln is emancipation, saving the Union, and dying for the nation's sins. So it had everything to do with it. If the outcome had been different, he wouldn't have been remembered this way. But there was a time when I was a kid when his virtues were celebrated. Just his personal virtues were celebrated: honesty and modesty and humor and sadness and all of these exceptional features that we don't emphasize today. Well, we don't teach much history today, sadly. And I think Lincoln was sort of the representative of American opportunity, of the American dream. And added to that is his ability to write about it. He was the best subject of log cabin to White House opportunity in America. But as Edmund Wilson said, he could have been a great writer of any kind. And the fact that he was a great writer about democracy gave us just sheer poetry about opportunity here.
Name any politicians in America, regardless of party. What political leaders in America could debate and talk in public the way Lincoln and Douglas did? Could any politicians do that debate today?
That's a great question. Mario Cuomo could have. I worked for him. I wrote speeches for him that he would say, I have a speech, but I'm not going to deliver it. And then he would throw it time after time after time. And then he would talk for 25 minutes. I think he was an exception. You're asking about current people. How about his son, Andrew? He's not in politics at the moment, but it's not required anymore. It's not a requirement of the DNA. What did politicians have to have, for example, in the 19th century, aside from the gift of gab, as we call it? They had to have really good voices, right? They had to project. Lincoln spoke to crowds of 5,000 or 6,000, and he, the idea that he had a voice that didn't penetrate crowds is a myth. It just was at a higher. He was like a Pavarotti tenor as opposed to Stephen Douglas's baritone or lower. You don't need that today. Bill Clinton would not have been a 19th century politician because he had a chronically hoarse voice. None of the recent presidents. Reagan would not have been able to project. He was a film actor, not a stage actor. It's just a different set of requirements today. And if politicians now are trained to do 1-minute answers before a gong goes off and a cane appears to drag them off the stage, they're not going to be able to carry on a political dialogue. So the answer is maybe nobody.